During the 1940s and 1960s, Glenn Ford was the Hollywood A-lister everyone wanted to see. He co-starred with Marlon Brando, Bette Davis, and Rita Hayworth in over 100 films over half a century, and in 1958 he became the highest-grossing actor of all time. You can't get a sense of the man he was behind all that glory. Glenn never wed the lady he loved the most, even though he loved her to the end of his life. Despite having a son, he abandoned him for almost 50 years. Hundreds of celebrities were involved with his affairs and 4 marriages. The only way his kid was able to prevent a nurse from marking his hospital bed with a do not resuscitate order was to take the matter to court. Quietly and alone in a hospital room that nobody appeared to care about, he passed away after creating famous performances in Gilda, The Big Heat, and Blackboard Jungle. Not everyone would want Glenn Ford as a parent, spouse, or lover, but he wasn't terrible either. He was a tragic and complicated figure in Hollywood history, and his son documented his life's tale, but he never mentioned a word about his inner inconsistencies or irreparable blunders. Glenn Ford, whose full name is Gwilym Samuel Newton Ford, came into this world on May 1, 1916, in the Canadian village of Portneuf. He had extraordinary blood flowing through his veins. On his father's side was a distant relative of Sir John Macdonald, the first Prime Minister of Canada, and on his mother's side was the 8th President of the United States, Martin Van Buren. There was a world of prestige and tradition and another of boundless ambition that Glenn had to navigate from the day he was born. A life-altering decision was made in 1924, when Glenn was 8 years old, when his family departed from Canada and relocated in Santa Monica, California. There, under the warm Pacific Coast sun, the young Canadian made his theatrical debut. For the first time, Glenn experienced the irresistible want to inhabit the character of another person and experience their tale through school plays at Santa Monica High School. Maybe he picked up the skill of concealing his own from that same moment as well. After finishing high school in 1934, Glenn became involved with various West Coast theater organizations. He was a hand-to-hand laborer without capital. In his spare time, he worked as a carpenter, electrician, and construction worker, and he also helped out around the house. The strict railroad boss who was his father drilled into him the need of having a skill in case Hollywood ever decides they don't need him. Nobody foresaw that Hollywood would require Glenn Ford, not the guy, but the idealized version of him that audiences aspired to believe in. He was turned down on his 1937 tryout at 20th Century Fox, returning to failure a year later. However, he persisted. After that, Columbia Pictures arrived, elevating the legendary Glenn Ford from obscurity in a small Canadian village to legendary status in Hollywood. It was a daring but planned move by Harry Cohn, head of Columbia Pictures, to have Glenn Ford officially sign a long-term contract in 1939. Cohn opted to focus on developing Columbia's next crop of actors rather than acquiring stars from rival companies. Along with one other name, William Holden, Glenn was selected. Heaven with a Barbed Wire Fence was Glenn's first big role, but according to Harry Cohn, it was anything but pleasant sailing. Ricardo Cortez, the film's director, made no secret of his disdain for him as an actor and vowed never to collaborate with him again. After all these years, Glenn still harbored a grudge against him. When they bumped into each other at a restaurant, she almost punched him. However, in Hollywood, a single innovation can alter the course of history. For Glenn Ford, it was the 1946 picture Gilda, starring Rita Hayworth, that catapulted them into movie history. For her era, Rita represented sex. Glenn, with his modest demeanor and easygoing personality, provided the ideal equilibrium. Although Rita received most of the attention, Glenn's performance resonated with viewers. The two began a mysterious and eerie romance that would last for 40 years, beginning with that picture. Glenn had a meteoric rise to fame following Gilda. His portrayal as a noir detective in 1953's The Big Heat was one of several classic films he featured in. The role garnered him an Academy Award nomination. Blackboard Jungle, 1955, co-starring Sidney Poitier, was an early example of an educational drama in which she played the role of a teacher at a dysfunctional school. The August Moon Tea House, a satirical comedy starring Marlon Brando, was released in 1956. His genuine abilities as a shooter and horseback rider were on display in the westerns 310 to Yuma, 1957, and Cowboy, 1958, confirming his competence in the genre. Glenn Ford became America's top box office star in 1958, an impressive feat for an actor who shied away from scandals and ostentation and kept a cool, collected demeanor throughout her career. Glenn remained consistent throughout the 1960s, appearing in films such as Cimarron, 1960, The Courtship of Eddie's Father, 1963, The Rounders, 1965, and Heaven with a Gun, 1969. despite the uneven quality of the films released during that decade. During the 1970s, as his star started to fade in Hollywood, he made the switch to television and continued to have success with shows like Cades County, The Family Hallvac, and Once an Eagle. Superman, the movie, 1978, was his last major film role, and it was a touching cameo as Jonathan Kent, Superman's adopted father. A simple glance, no elaborate lines, no dramatic gestures. Again, Glenn moved the crowd with his poise, serenity, and unflinching compassion. He appeared in a handful of supporting parts in his twilight years, including 1979's Day of the Assassin. However, it was clear to all. Glenn Ford's heyday was over, and the darkness of an unsalvageable past loomed ahead of him. He never truly forgave himself, the lady he loved, or the son he left behind. War bonds and performances for troops were two ways that many famous Americans decided to help their nation out when the United States entered World War II. Similar to this, Glenn Ford continued in this role until he abruptly told the director of Destroyer, 1943, that he couldn't continue performing the role of a soldier. He then signed up as a volunteer with the U.S. Marine Corps Reserve. It was a shocking decision for Hollywood. Columbia Pictures CEO Harry Cohn was enraged. Currently, he was in the process of making Glenn the most famous artist in the studio. Nonetheless, Glenn made the decision to go. Not content to merely play the role, he aspired to really serve in the military. Despite this, Glenn's heroic arc was cut short by his health problems, which he encountered shortly after being assigned to the Marine Corps' Public Relations Division. He was found to have a duodenal ulcer by the doctors, a medical issue that rendered him unfit for deployment due to the excruciating pain it caused in the 5 months he spent in the hospital. It was a silent disappointment that he never spoke about, for someone who desired to establish their worth. In 1944, he was discharged and went back to acting in films. Glenn Ford was proud to have served, even if he never saw battle. He remained in the Navy Reserve and rose through the ranks to the position of lieutenant commander, where he oversaw military media and cultural outreach initiatives. Almost 50 years after the fact, in 1992, Glenn received the highest French honor for assisting civilians escaping Nazi persecution, the Legion of Honor. In the years following World War II, he aligned himself with justice through his image, attitude, and humanitarian activity, as well as through films, fundraising tours, and other means. Even though Glenn Ford never ever discharged a weapon in combat, he lived his life according to the code the soldier had taught him. Restrained, conscientious, and occasionally too introverted to seek assistance. Even though he was a devoted serviceman in the eyes of the military, he was a man who struggled to maintain relationships outside of work. People were captivated by his radiance. However, that same radiance drove loved ones farther away. And with that, yet another tragedy began. Still, unbroken, and deeper than any battleground, love, marriage, or broken father-son tie. Glenn Ford made her film debut in 1940's The Lady in Question, which starred a mesmerizing young actress. Rita Hayworth was her name. Neither of them had achieved fame yet when this happened. Despite the fact that they were both in the early stages of their careers, there was an undeniable synergy between them that went beyond mere performance. Their on-screen interactions were electric, with electric glances and silent lingering. Both performers had grown emotionally and technically by the time they reconnected in Gilda, 1946, 6 years later. They started in unnamed love, and Gilda became famous. "I never saw Gilda as a movie," Glenn once commented. "It was a memory." And Rita, surrounded by fame and loneliness, found in Glenn something she had always lacked: quiet protection. But timing stood in their way. When Glenn was single, Rita was married to Edward Judson. When Rita divorced, Glenn had already married Eleanor Powell. Then came her marriages to Orson Welles and Prince Ali Khan. Were always out of sync, yet they never stopped finding their way back to each other. When Rita lived in her Beverly Hills home with her then husband, screenwriter James Hill, she told Glenn that the plot of land next door had just gone up for sale. Glenn didn't hesitate. He bought it and built a new house, just steps from Rita's backyard wall. And then, just one day after Glenn moved in, Rita filed for divorce. No one said a word, everything was understood. Glenn installed a small gate in the back fence so Rita could walk over any time without the press knowing. They had breakfast together, sunbathed by Glenn's pool, and lived like anonymous lovers in the heart of Hollywood. In 1972, Rita jokingly told the press, "Glenn is the best neighbor a woman could ask for." But behind that smile was a deeper truth. They were everything to each other, yet never truly each other's. Over the decades that followed, through countless other affairs, Glenn Ford never forgot Rita. He said every movie she appeared in was among his favorites and that, "I loved her deeply, always." By 1981, Rita began to lose her memory. Doctors diagnosed her with early-onset Alzheimer's, a symbol of Hollywood beauty, of vivacity, was slowly forgetting everything, including herself. Glenn didn't walk away. He quietly supported her, cared for her through her final stages. When Rita died in 1987 at the age of 68, Glenn was one of the pallbearers, walking slowly behind her casket. No speech, no tears, but everyone knew. Within him, a silent ocean was breaking. No one ever knew exactly what happened between them over those 40 years. They never married, never lived under the same roof, but they were never truly apart. "A part of her will always live in me," Glenn once said in a documentary about Rita Hayworth's life. And to audiences, perhaps that was the most beautiful and the saddest love story Hollywood ever kept hidden in the shadows. If Rita Hayworth was the woman Glenn Ford never married but loved with all his heart, then Eleanor Powell was the woman he married, but never truly loved the right way. In 1943, at a war bond fundraising party, Glenn, then serving in the military, met Eleanor, Hollywood's reigning queen of tap dance, a woman who had once outshone even her co-stars in MGM's grand musicals. Her strength, grace, and selfless heart captivated Glenn. Less than a year later, they married. He still lived with his mother and she with hers. After the wedding, they moved into a 22-room mansion in Beverly Hills, a symbol of Glenn's rise from the working class and also the place where Eleanor ended her artistic career. At 33, at the height of her fame, she gave up the stage, the audience, and the applause to become Glenn Ford's wife and the mother of their only child, Peter. Born in 1945, but for Glenn, then entering the golden years of his career, her devotion wasn't enough to keep him grounded. While Eleanor poured her soul into their family, Glenn fell into a string of extramarital affairs, from co-stars on set to fleeting romances. No one knows the exact count, but according to Peter Ford, his father recorded over 140 private conversations with various Hollywood starlets, including Judy Garland, Marilyn Monroe, Joan Crawford, Geraldine Brooks. There were no violent fights, no public breakdowns, but what hurt Eleanor most was the long, unexplained coldness. In that grand three-story house, they lived in silent, separate worlds. Eleanor lived upstairs. Glenn stayed on the ground floor. Their son Peter lived in the middle, with his grandmother Hannah, a family of 3 under one roof. Yet none touched the world of the other. Peter would later recall, "My father didn't hug me, didn't talk to my mother. He just appeared when he had to, then vanished." After 16 years of a marriage that wasn't truly a marriage, Eleanor quietly filed for divorce in 1959, just as Peter turned 14. Glenn signed the papers without resistance. Eleanor took her son with her, but never the heart of the man she had once given up the world for. For the next 23 years, Eleanor never remarried, never loved anyone else. She quietly devoted herself to charity, raising her son, and engaging in religious work, as if the rest of her life was spent atoning for a love that arrived at the wrong time with the wrong man. When she died in 1982 from cancer, her ashes were placed in a simple brass urn at Hollywood Forever Cemetery. No grand service, no media presence. Only Peter was there, the boy she once called, the only reason to keep going. Glenn didn't attend the funeral. Maybe he was too busy. Or maybe he didn't know how to face it. Among the hundreds of women who passed through Glenn Ford's life, only one child carried his name. But that child, Peter Newton Ford, grew up in a house where his father was little more than a shadow. After Eleanor Powell filed for divorce in 1959, she was granted custody. Glenn didn't contest it. He also didn't stay in touch. Throughout Peter's formative years, Glenn was almost entirely absent. No letters, no phone calls, no advice when his son first faced the world. Peter once said, "He was my father biologically, but he wasn't there. My father loved women, loved his work. Loved everything except being a father." Glenn sent a modest monthly support check, just enough to avoid being labeled irresponsible, but never enough to fill the void of an empty childhood. While he starred in films as courageous men and devoted fathers, Peter lived with his mother and grandmother, in a house where the past never quite rested. Even more bitter was the fact that Glenn and Peter often worked together, especially on the television series Cades County during the 1970s. But on set, they were two colleagues, more distant than strangers. No hugs, no shared meals after filming, no proud glance from a father to his son. And then, time did what no one could stop. Glenn grew old. After a series of strokes, he lost the ability to walk. His memory began to fail. He needed a wheelchair and became completely dependent on others. It was during this period that he called Peter back, not as a son, but simply as someone he needed help from. But now, under one roof again, there were no longer separate floors, just a broken father and a son trying to make sense of his life, surrounded by the sound of medical machines and the fragments of a fading memory. Peter began asking, Glenn began telling, stories no one had heard. Affairs long hidden, fears never confessed, a life lived to the fullest, but never lived truthfully with the only person who called him dad. In a later interview, Peter recalled, for the first time, my father looked at me for a long time, then said, "Do you remember when you were little?" And that's when I knew he was trying to make things right. Late, but sincere. After Glenn's death, Peter published the memoir, Glenn Ford, A Life, 2011. Not to condemn, not to seek revenge, but to tell the story his father had chosen to keep hidden his entire life. A man once admired by the whole world, once loved by the most beautiful women, but in the end, he could only ask the son he had once abandoned to write for him 2 words he could never say for himself, understood. At the height of his fame, Glenn Ford was a man Hollywood deeply respected. But in his final years, he was no longer the Glenn Ford the public once knew. No more steady gaze, no upright posture, no sharp memory or warm, grounded smile. After turning 70, Glenn began to suffer a series of strokes, each one more severe than the last. His nervous system deteriorated. His memory started to blur. And his body no longer obeyed him. Once a man who strode confidently across film sets, he now relied on a wheelchair, completely dependent on others. During this time, Glenn didn't live with his son, but instead with Pauline Kernan, a much younger private nurse hired for full-time care. But things soon turned suspicious. According to Peter Ford, his father completely trusted Pauline. Glenn had updated his will, leaving the majority of his estate to her, striking out nearly all family members. The breaking point came when Peter discovered that Pauline had placed a do not resuscitate DNR order outside Glenn's hospital room, despite Glenn still being lucid, communicative, and clearly wanting to live. Peter had to go to court, not to fight over money, but to fight for his father's right to stay alive. After the hearing, the DNR order was revoked, the care terms revised, and Pauline was removed as Glenn's medical proxy. It wasn't just a legal battle. It was the final confrontation between a son and the looming shadow of a father who had been emotionally distant his entire life. After the ordeal, Glenn personally asked Peter and his family to move in with him. At that point, he was no longer a screen legend, no longer a charming lover, no longer a neglectful father. He was just an old man, frail, diminished, clinging to what little remained in the one embrace that had finally opened to him. Glenn lived a few more years in quiet. He stopped acting, stopped giving interviews, stopped writing. In the Beverly Hills home, once a sanctuary of love with Rita, once echoing with Peter's childhood laughter, there was now only the sound of wheels on tile, the soft hum of a breathing machine, and sighs fading like mist at the end of a day. At 4 p.m. on August 30, 2006, Glenn Ford passed away in silence. He was 90. There was no grand funeral, no sweeping farewell from Hollywood. But by personal request, the ashes of his beloved dog, Bismar, the loyal 4-legged companion who had always slept by his bedside, were buried with him at Woodland Cemetery in Santa Monica. Peaceful ending, but not a light-hearted one. Because to the audience, he would always be a symbol. But to himself, his entire life may have been a long journey in search of one thing: forgiveness. From the women he loved, the son he left behind, and the man he never fully made peace with. Glenn Ford was never a loud star. He didn't act with grand gestures, didn't wave his arms on screen, didn't play the publicity game in real life. And it was precisely because of that Glenn became the kind of actor an entire generation of American audiences once trusted, empathized with, and saw as a reflection of themselves. He played the teacher in Blackboard Jungle, the cop in The Big Heat, the Western farmer in Cowboy, the father in Superman. In each role, he didn't overwhelm the audience. He made them feel close, safe, and quietly heartbroken when he failed. Critics once called Glenn Ford the ordinary man in extraordinary circumstances. He wasn't Clark Gable, nor was he Marlon Brando or James Dean. But he was Glenn Ford, the scene partner everyone wanted to work with, the kind of man every viewer believed was real. Over a career that spanned more than 50 years, Glenn Ford starred in over 100 films, across nearly every genre. Film noir, Gilda, The Big Heat, social drama, Blackboard Jungle, The Doctor and the Girl, westerns, 310 to Yuma, The Fastest Gun Alive, Jubal, comedies, The Tea House of the August Moon, The Courtship of Eddie's Father, and even superhero films, Superman, the movie, 1978. In 1958, he was the #1 box office star in America. A title few actors held for more than a year. He held it for 4. But the bitter truth is not many remember Glenn Ford today. There's no towering tribute on Hollywood Boulevard, no grand memorial after his death, no revival campaigns for his classic films like those devoted to Humphrey Bogart or John Wayne. In one interview, Peter Ford said, "My father was incredibly famous until he died." And then within months, his name faded from Hollywood conversations. Perhaps it was because Glenn never courted controversy. No scandals, no public meltdowns, no tragic end like so many other icons. Glenn Ford left this world the same way he lived in it. Quietly, steadfastly, and without begging to be remembered. And it's that very quality that makes him worthy of remembrance. Because his legacy doesn't lie in statues or ceremonies. It lives in every scene where he didn't act, but simply existed, a lingering glance, a restrained line, a man who was never perfect, but achingly, hauntingly real. Glenn Ford never tried to become a legend. He didn't fight to be remembered, didn't step onto the stage to dazzle, and never used his pain to manipulate public attention. And yet, that's exactly why he became one of the hardest artists to forget. Once you sit quietly and look behind the curtain, his life was a series of contradictions between love and distance, between light and shadow, between the man admired by the public and the man his family never fully understood. He loved one woman for 40 years, but could never marry her, abandoned his only child only to return begging for forgiveness when time was nearly gone, reached the pinnacle of fame and then faded into obscurity without fanfare. Hollywood may have forgotten his name. The films that made him famous may now sit in storage. But if you've ever watched Gilda, ever been moved by his gaze in The Big Heat, ever felt his presence in Blackboard Jungle, ever felt reassured seeing him as Superman's father, then you've already touched a piece of Glenn Ford's legacy. A legacy not of titles, not of medals, but of the simple knowledge that a man like that once existed. Quiet, resilient, and full of unseen scars. If you believe that legends like Glenn Ford, those who stayed true to themselves until the very end, deserve to be remembered, understood, and honored, then share this story. Have you ever seen a Glenn Ford film? What do you remember about him? Leave us a comment, so his name doesn't vanish into silence. And don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more untold, unforgettable stories about the legends you love.